Hello, my name is Brigitte Lejuez. I speak to you from Ireland. Welcome to year 2 of the Eurasia Foundation course on Sustainable Futures. Today I will expand on last year's lecture, which dealt with one of the Sustainable Development Goals as defined by the United Nations, Goal 2, that focuses on ways to eradicate hunger, ensure food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. More specifically, within this goal, Target 2.4 aims to ensure that by 2030 there will be sustainable food production systems, and it also aims to implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and production, help maintain ecosystems, build capacity to adapt to climate change and extreme weather conditions, and gradually improve land and soil quality. Last year, we investigated the value of permaculture and veganism in ensuring fair and sustainable futures regarding food scarcity and hunger in the world. You can view the video of this lecture from the link placed on the last slide of this presentation. This year, we are going to examine the presence of permaculture in literary texts and their role in raising awareness and offering solutions for sustainable futures, and determine whether a new literary genre is now appearing, that of permacultural fiction. We are specifically going to explore the relations between sustainable food production questions and a possible environmentalist praxis in the eco-critical literature of the 2020s. Let's first take a look at the current context. On the occasion of COP27 held in November 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, representatives from around the world discuss global warming, its disastrous effects in many respects, and possible short, medium, and long-term solutions. Among the most worrying consequences of the current situation, more frequent droughts have been creating pockets of actual or potential famine around the world. 27 of the 35 most affected by global warming suffer from extreme food insecurity. The poorest populations who have caused the least environmental damage are the most affected. Yet the Western economic system still encourages agricultural practices that are devastating to soils and biodiversity, as well as an overconsumption of processed products, resulting in a multitude of diseases for a large proportion of the world's population. This acknowledgement was discussed at COP27, as well as the need to transform existing food systems in order to adapt them to climatic conditions which are deteriorating from year to year. Considering the efforts that are beginning to be made by the international community at political and economic levels to remedy the situation, it seems appropriate to consider the role of literature in raising awareness of ways of cultivating and eating differently in order to ensure the survival and good health of all, and also of the natural environment, not only now but in the long term too. What is or can be the role of literature in raising awareness on ways of cultivating and eating differently to ensure the survival and good health of all, and essentially of the natural environment? Recently fictional, including graphic novels, we'll talk further about them in a moment, and non-fictional accounts, including documentaries, those of author and director Cyril Dion among them, have tried to answer the central question consisting, since the conventional large-scale production models have proved to be noxious failures, in identifying new or currently underdeveloped models that could be considered in order to simultaneously solve food problems, preserve the environment, and improve community conditions. We can observe a growing presence of permaculture in contemporary literature, particularly through speculative and science fiction, or so-called cli-fi novels, which imagine and highlight the rapid development of the means that permaculture offers in terms of increasing access to small-scale agricultural areas, proposing a framework of productive and sustainable and, moreover, organic practices, making it possible to concretely envisage food security within a fairer social framework on a planetary scale. This study places itself in the field of eco-criticism, both a critical method and an ethical discourse which presents itself as a point of convergence between the arts and the sciences, in order to demonstrate that current novelists have themselves seized this approach, giving rise to eco-critical creations. The emergence of a permacultural literature represents a new aspect both in the evolution of comparative literary studies and also in the conception of the humanities in the Anthropocene. The purpose of eco-criticism, in a nutshell, is to study all that relates to the natural world and environmental issues from an aesthetic, ethical, and nowadays more systematically political point of view. This theoretical framework approaches any text dealing with nature from an interdisciplinary point of view that includes various forms of literatures, as well as the visual arts and sociological and scientifically based narratives. If eco-criticism in its beginnings focused mainly on canonical works, it now adapts to all genres, regardless of their period, and moreover, it re-examines the canon according to the environmental criteria of the moment. Martin Puschner, in Literature for a Changing Planet, that was published in 2022, considers it essential that literary researchers use eco-criticism in order to reconsider ancient texts through the prism of today's ecological concerns. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh for Puschner illustrates the fact that, shaping the environment, men have always built walls to repel the chaos, the savagery, and therefore the danger they perceive in the natural world. Puschner adds that this type of rejection is clearly present in Homer's Odyssey, particularly in the episode of the Cyclops. These beings, who live in isolation and do not work the land according to conventional practices, maybe they use a form of permaculture, are brutally eliminated by Ulysses, a supporter of commerce and the city. But Homer's text contains elements that contradict the negative perception of the Cyclops, as their hard and painstaking work provides abundantly for their community. This reading allows for a more favorable appreciation of the so-called monsters centered on their agricultural and social ethics. New novels move away from traditional anthropocentrism and dwell on radically new methods of land use. This choice is based entirely on a new understanding of nature, or rather on a return to the appreciation of the natural environment as such, and not only as an essential element for human survival. One of the most recent and best received novels of the past 5 years, Richard Powers' 2019 Pulitzer Fiction Prize winning The Overstory, tells the stories of a group diversity of characters whose lives are changed by their encounters with trees. The book touches on many themes and ideas that are central to permaculture, such as the interconnectedness of all living things and the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem health. This novel allows the trees to dominate the thinking of the characters to the point of leading them to militant action, which provokes in readers what eco-criticism aims to trigger: an awareness, a feeling of personal responsibility that can lead to a change of attitude, even lifestyle. Benjamin Markowitz's review of the novel illustrates this. He says, "The Overstory leaves you with a slightly adjusted frame of reference. Time matters differently. You look at the trees outside your window more curiously, suspiciously even, and I found while reading that some of what was happening to its characters passed into my conscience, like alcohol into the bloodstream, and left a feeling behind of grief or guilt even after I put it down." Perceptions of nature over time have shaped literary genres, from the pastoral to the urban. However, they were mostly anthropocentric. A change in perspective is leading to permaculture fiction today. As Karl Khosrow reminds us, eco-criticism is a cultural analysis which, contrary to the usual anthropocentric mode of the human sciences, is interested more broadly in the history of environmental conditions, in ecological thought, and in the recognition of the central role of social policy, in particular environmental justice. Its definition, therefore, involves important ethical and often militant dimensions relating both to human life and to life other than human. Ursula Heiser asserts that through eco-critical analysis, the very concept of nature is closely examined, and she adds, eco-criticism analyzes the ways in which literature represents the human relation to nature at particular moments of history, what values are assigned to nature and why, and how perceptions of the natural shape literary tropes and genres. In turn, it examines how such literary figures contribute to shaping social and cultural attitude towards the environment. It is therefore not only a question of considering the evolution of the relationship of humans to nature and its representation in the arts, but also of identifying how these various perceptions of nature over time have shaped literary genres, particularly graphic novels and speculative literature, both of which today give rise to permacultural fiction. Stephanie Postumus, for her part, emphasizes the reforming quality of eco-criticism, which starts from the political conviction that mankind is in the process of destroying its habitat and that it must change its behavior, and to that effect change its economic model. In his book The Environmental Imagination in 1995, Lawrence Buell already raised the need for an environmentalist praxis, that is to say, a structured approach including concrete actions. Eco-criticism thus encourages today to show absolute commitment to the ecological cause. Eco-critical scholars endorse the consideration of new perspectives, the development of a green sensibility, leading to collective efforts for real change to stem climate and environmental catastrophe. Novelists, too, are now moving more and more in this direction. Recent publications on the subject underline the diversification of eco-criticism towards increasingly nuanced subdisciplines, such as affective, narrative, post-colonial, zoocentric, phytocentric, hydrocentric, or climatic eco-criticism, for example, which form a set of empirical and applied methods focused on change. In The Value of Eco-Criticism, Timothy Clark acknowledges that the multiple cultural, social, and intellectual facets of eco-criticism expand endlessly and reveal the capacity of aesthetic forms to adapt to environmental issues on a global scale. Eco-criticism, whose beginnings date back to 1923, therefore 1 century ago, has now over time taken its place so well in the critical approach to all subjects relating to ecology that it penetrates artistic creation. I would like to show here that certain literary productions today implement the environmentalist praxis and that their authors therefore write eco-critically, according to the same ethical, cultural, political and social principles as permaculture. Before we move on to the literary text, let's briefly return to the current situation whose facts are used in fictional accounts, demanding action to prepare for and obtain food security for all. Agricultural sustainability is the key to ending world hunger. This is the conclusion of a recent report published by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the FAO. It states that if agriculture does not adapt to the new environmental conditions, climate change will increase the number of food insecure people by 2030. This report highlights that world hunger is on the rise and impacted up to 828 million people in 2021, 46 million more than a year ago, and 150 million more than in 2019. This situation also affects women more than men. In 2021, the gender gap in food insecurity widened further. 31.9% of women globally were moderately or severely food insecure, compared to 27.6% of men. Furthermore, it is estimated that in 2021, 45 million children under the age of 5 were suffering from wasting, the deadliest form of malnutrition, which can increase the risk of death among children by 12 times. In addition, 149 million children under the age of 5 were stunted and developmentally impaired due to a chronic lack of essential nutrients in their diets. The FAO advocates for the use of agroecological methods to build the resilience of food systems, especially in severely affected regions. A more natural and traditional approach to farming could help mitigate the impact of climate change. Agribusiness companies sometimes invoke a moral imperative to feed a hungry world in order to defend agricultural policies and distract from the destruction that modern agriculture inflicts on the environment and human health. Increasing food production in a sustainable manner and improving food security involves education initiatives, the use of economic incentives, and the development of new appropriate technologies, ensuring stable supplies of nutritionally adequate food, access to these supplies through vulnerable groups, and production for markets, creation of employment and income to reduce poverty, management of natural resources and protection of the environment. It also means putting an end to the dominant economic modes, growing locally and, if possible and necessary, collectively, and being ready to change traditions and food habits. Over time, researchers and practitioners of alternative methods, through their publications, have enabled mentalities to change. For a history of permaculture till today, please see last year's lecture, and here I give you the link. And the texts we are about to examine imagine the progressively global implementation on these methods. As we saw earlier, eco-criticism makes it possible to highlight in various types of text the ancestral and current impact of humans on the earth, and to apply a critical discourse that advocates an approach to the environment, both literary and cultural as well as political. It therefore makes it possible to examine creative approaches whose aim is to change mentalities. One of the seminal books whose transformative influence has led to the spread of permaculture, Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring, has inspired artistic initiatives. For example, it has elicited a number of poetic responses, including Wild Reckoning, an anthology provoked by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 2004. Recently, some specialists have begun to empirically assess the influence of ecofiction on readers. I would like to argue that not only is it indeed essential to identify the reception of environmentalist narratives on readers, but that this approach must include the authors of fiction themselves as active readers. This type of reception is measured according to an aesthetic gap, that is to say, the distance between the horizon of expectation of readers, passive and active, and a new text that can transform perspectives by challenging familiar experiences, habits and social norms, and by leading readers to question them. A new generation of artists, authors, composers and photographers alike are now seizing themes linked to various environmental subjects in a more radical way than before, advocating a hands-on approach. These subjects increasingly include references to permaculture. Recently, in the comic book genre, there has been a shift from informational works on the environment and the effects of climate change to fictional works which aim to alert the public. French author Jan Werling, in his album Tous dans le même bateau, Biodiversité, il est encore temps d'agir, in 2022, for example, encourages his readers to develop a real awareness of the problems at stake and urges them to take action. Others imagine a transformative adventure like permacomics, to which we shall now turn. As well as Werling's book just mentioned, there is the Atlas de l'Anthropocène by François Gémen and Alexander Rankovich, regularly updated, that factually denounces the social, political, agricultural and industrial decisions and practices that participate in the pollution of the planet, the destruction of ecosystems, and generally drive climate change. Our main focus on this point, also in the French language, is this album called Permacomics, Vivre en Permaculture. It's a French graphic novel manual published in 2020 by Guizou, which actually represents a couple of screenwriters, and Cécile Barnéou, who is the illustrator. mixing fiction and presentation of a concept to the greatest number. It is situated in the present and offers an educational approach. The main character, a 30-year-old man tired of his status as an employee in a large company, decides to try another way of life. He and his partner decide to take a year off to learn about permaculture. On board a van, they go to meet people who can give them the means to carry out this mission. This comic strip illustrates the new trend permaculture fiction is initiating that counters collapsology and eco-anxiety and gives rise to a positive attitude. In the case of permacomics, the hurdles that the protagonists have to face in their excitingly new yet uncertain situation ultimately lead them to an optimistic outlook thanks to the pragmatic possibilities offered by permaculture. Permacomics stands out from the batch of recent graphic novels which tend to share personal perspectives, often based on experience or knowledge in the field. These albums are indeed very useful, and it is worth remembering that the graphic novel has always evolved within the generic interlaces of literature and cultural analysis. Here, following its own environmentalist praxis, permacomics takes a stand by choosing ordinary people as characters whose lives will be turned upside down by the discovery of permaculture, which in practice will allow them to live according to their principles and even to develop them. With obvious expertise and creativity, most comic books dealing with this subject constitute documentaries that propose individual and collective actions, including the planting of trees and the organization of communal gardens in urban areas. They thus participate in a familiarization with the basic principles of permaculture and its concrete solutions. Permacomics, however, through fiction, involves its readers personally and allows them to imagine that living in permaculture also means living differently, if not elsewhere, and changing the world. The cautious optimism of this album comes from the very ethos of permaculture, which is to care for the earth by allowing all life systems to continue and multiply, ensuring people can avail equally of resources necessary for their existence, and setting limits on consumption while redistributing the surplus. Permaculture practices have shown that permaculture can provide and restore water sources to areas where it was thought that there were none or where they had disappeared, and that it does not add any pollution to waterways or coastal marine ecosystems. Permaculture farms also create their own energy with wind turbines and solar panels, providing independence at the local level for both individuals and communities. While permaculture isn't about producing huge yields that could be sold on an industrial scale, it does provide human-scale economic growth that gives communities jobs that pay people enough to support themselves and their families. Permaculture is also present in many cities around the world, making them more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. The protection, restoration, and promotion of terrestrial ecosystems makes it possible to fight against desertification and also contributes to the preservation of aquatic ecosystems. Helping natural ecosystems to regenerate also means bringing wildlife back to areas where they had disappeared. Permaculture also advocates landscape models, offering possible habitats. It seeks to minimize waste and energy input and works synergistically. The implementation of permaculture varies considerably depending on the region in which it is practiced, especially since a permaculture garden or farm aims to capture and store energy locally and to maximize renewable resources. To remind ourselves of the different permaculture projects all around the world, again I invite you to look at last year's video, whose link is on this slide. Let's now move on to the literary permacultural approach. The great project of creating a better world because it is fairer and more respectful of life is that of the novel The Ministry for the Future by American author Kim Stanley Robinson, a kind of counterweight to apocalyptic visions of climate catastrophe. Robinson has already explored the devastating effects of the climate in his previous novels, including food shortages. For instance, in his novel 2312, which was actually published in 2012, for example. In an interview, Robinson asserts that science fiction is the best realism for our time because, along with talking about future scenarios, those future scenarios are always metaphors for the way things feel right now. This definition applies equally to other forms of speculative fiction, such as climate fiction and the subgenre I have identified here, permacultural fiction. Here, Robinson imagines the individual stories of fictional future eyewitnesses and activists to express the reality of climate change while providing solutions to it that seem believable. By mixing current reality and the probable near future, it tests hypotheses that could become real answers. It proceeds through various narrative perspectives, one per chapter, sometimes recurring and sometimes anonymous, out of 106 chapters. As Adeline Jones-Putra points out, he's building this huge universe where there are so many ways in and so many perspectives and interconnectedness, and jumping across the scales while still activating our sense of individual human agency within that. Faced with the inertia of governments to take the draconian measures necessary to curb climate change, modern cli-fi designs different operating models involving multi-layered governance whose decision-making scope is international. The Ministry for the Future is an imaginary institution created when it appeared obvious that the signatories of the actual 2015 agreement at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris, known as COP21, have not reached their goals. The mission of the Ministry for the Future is to defend future generations of citizens of the world whose rights, as defined by a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are as valid as ours today. This ministry will do everything to fight climate change, save the natural world, and with it humanity. In order to achieve these ends, its members will adopt all kinds of methods, including the riskiest. Regarding the role of permaculture in this phenomenal project, Robinson takes his cue from measures and projects already in place, basing his novel's premise on a realistic picture, and imagines their positive development years after the Paris Agreement, on the occasion of which ambitious commitments were made, those which still constitute the benchmarks of today. The Ministry for the Future is created in Zurich in 2025, after an exceptional heat wave that claimed millions of victims in Uttar Pradesh, a state in northern India. Locally, the Indian authorities are embarking on a very ambitious program aimed at restoring the soil and contributing to the reduction of greenhouse gases. And I quote from the novel, "Sikkim and Bengal have been developing an organic regenerative agriculture that at the same time it provides more food than before, also sequesters more carbon in the soil, and this too has been taken up across the country. Indian agriculture moving into its post-green revolution is also a giant step toward independent subtropical knowledge production, achieved in collaboration with Indonesian and African and South American permaculturists, and its importance going forward cannot be overemphasized." When Mary Murphy, who leads the multinational team of the Ministry for the Future, visits Karnataka, a state located in the south of India, to see the progress made and to draw the conclusions of what could apply everywhere in the world, she notices greens of several shades, but also rectangles of yellow, orange, red, purple, dark brown, even pale blue, flowers of spice crops apparently. "Everything grows here," new local host says, named Indra Pramit. "Best soil and climate on earth. Now banking 7 parts per thousand of carbon per year. Immense drawdown. Also food for millions. Local tenure rights for local farmers. No absent landlords anymore. Keep room for wild animals in the hedgerows and habitat corridors. And all organic. No pesticides at all." This new system is based on the very real work of the Indian ecofeminist Vandana Shiva, who received the Alternative Nobel Prize in 1993 and directs the Research Foundation for Science, Technology and Natural Resource Policy, an institution founded in 1982 whose goal is the development of sustainable farming methods. In the novel, this system has made it possible not only to give land rights to those who work the land, but also to establish the equality of the latter. The Dalits, formerly untouchable, are part of it, and women of all castes have the right to sit on the Panchayat, the local council responsible for rural development. The establishment of social justice is indeed at the heart of permaculture concerns, which consider, quite contrary to historical practices, that there can be no real and viable change without erasing discrimination and inequalities of gender and income. As we'll see now, Kim Stanley Robinson actually extends the meaning of what is permaculture. In a 2007 interview, he argued, but if you think of yourself as terraforming Earth, and if you think about sustainability, then you can start thinking about permaculture and what permaculture really means. It's not just sustainable agriculture, but a name for a certain type of history, because the word sustainability is now code for let's make capitalism work over the long haul without ever getting rid of the hierarchy between rich and poor and without establishing social justice. And these thoughts actually find themselves in his novel. Indeed, other regions of the world that were very degraded in terms of soils and water quality and biodiversity, such as California, pursue a similar model to the Indian one. They adapt it to their own culture and traditions and aim at bringing about a revival in agriculture, in the economy, as well as in society. In addition to the planting of hedges, trees and shrubs of local species, deep ploughing of the land is done away with, and the restoration of the soil through the use of natural compost provided by animals is championed instead. Together, these measures restore sustainable soil production, and with that comes a new incentive. Carbon sequestration will now be worth literally gold to the people of the planet, including farmers and even industrialists, receiving for their effort carbony, a new reserve currency endorsed by the main bank in the world. As the novel progresses, initiatives multiply, even the most radical ones. A whole chapter, chapter 85, is devoted to the list of ecological projects in permaculture, reforestation and agroforestry, restoration and conservation of all kinds, present on all the continents of the world, each country being very proud to announce its results. It should also be mentioned that over time the human population has decreased, whereas that of animals has increased. The natural balance is thus gradually restored. Especially since the climate is actually improving thanks in particular to the reduction in greenhouse gases obtained after years of progressive resolutions and trends of all kinds, from cities to rural and mountainous regions and from deserts to oceans. Robinson offers a novel with very precise technical descriptions that both produces dramatic interest and a reflection for the readers on the possible alternatives to the current world system. Kim Stanley Robinson belongs to this current of optimistic fiction that we have identified, which seeks to convince that despite the catastrophes we are told we will experience in the future, solutions exist to repair the planet before it is too late. As Robinson himself suggested, his novel is actually realistic, since it stems from his careful examination of reliable theories, articles and scientific reports. It expands these to a global scale in order to create a progressive and participatory vision, provoking in readers, contrary to the anxiety provoked by many representation and discourses today, the sense of a possible future, not only because the planet he imagines remains livable, but also because what has been achieved is a serene, just and overall better future. Robinson's writing is indeed eco-critical in the sense that his approach is that of an environmentalist praxis aimed at transforming the world through concrete actions. It is also permacultural since it adopts not only permaculture as one of its main themes, but also and above all the permaculture ethic, which aims to ensure the sustainability of the natural world while accepting different types of transformations toward a better balanced world, without this being considered utopian. As Robinson himself says, we should take the political and aesthetic baggage out of the term utopia. I've been working all my career to try to redefine utopia in more positive terms, in more dynamic terms. People tend to think of utopia as a perfect end stage, which is by definition impossible and maybe even bad for us. And so maybe it's better to use a word like permaculture, which not only includes permanent, but also permutation. Permaculture suggests a certain kind of obvious human goal, which is that future generations will have at least as good a place to live as what we have now. We have now reached our last example, the 2020 novel entitled 470 by Australian author Linda Woodrow. Ecological representations in literature are indeed experiments that are both creative and critical, channeling the imagination towards ways of thinking that allow the emergence of new perceptions. For Russ Grayson, the genre of speculative literature helps bring to light innovative permaculture ideas. 470 tells the story of family and friends in the hinterland eco-village of Mullumbimby in the Bayernshire in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, and of their efforts to find a new way to live in a deteriorating climatic situation with its damaging weather conditions and ensuing social breakdown. Permaculture is already well established in the region. It is even one of the many permaculture enclaves across the country. Like Robinson, Woodrow emphasizes the scientific evidence within our reach. I love the scientific method for observing and understanding reality, and thus I find it hard to believe that anyone doesn't believe that climate change requires us all to seriously change our addictive consumerism, she says. And indeed, her novel is based on a painstaking search for resilience, both psychological and ecological, in calamitous circumstances. David Holmgren, one of the most innovative figures in the permaculture movement, reacts to reading 470 as follows. Drawing on a life lived by permaculture ethics and principles, Linda weaves together the threads of a rich tapestry of possibilities, igniting our imagination of how hope and vision can emerge from the darkest of circumstances. Woodrow is known for her textbooks and commitment to permaculture, and her novel is based on her research into the sociological impacts of climate change from a memoir entitled Imagined Futures, Narrative Fiction and Climate Science. Working from the simple premise that climate change is happening, Woodrow began by asking what the world would look like if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere reached 470 parts per million by volume, CO2. Not a far-fetched premise, considering that in January 2021, the Earth's atmosphere contained 415.13 ppm. This content was 283.4 ppm in 1839, according to ice cores taken from Antarctica, an increase of about 46% in 182 years. And it continues to increase. In January 2022, there were 416.89 ppm, and on January 7, 2023, a month ago, 419.25 ppm. A lifetime of applying and writing about permaculture has provided Woodrow with a large reservoir of experience to draw on to craft a story of perseverance, empowerment, and optimism in the face of loss and despair. The action of 470 is set in 2031, when the government is no longer able to pay the salaries of its health workers or provide assistance to the economically displaced population, and in other disasters, drastic weather conditions redraw the coastline. Similarly to what happens at the beginning of the Ministry for the Future, the temperatures rise and cause death in humans and in animals. When the consequences of disrupted systems on the supply chains of services, food, medicines, and transport are felt, the protagonists must consider practical and sustainable ethical solutions, including, of course, permaculture. Woodrow, through her practice of regenerative agriculture, enabling community resilience, and through her work as a novelist, demonstrates the feasibility of an environmentalist praxis fundamentally based on permaculture ethics, a praxis that can be described as permacultural. And now for our conclusions. Eco-criticism, as defined by commentators and practiced by authors, encourages an awareness of environmental issues in order to facilitate the adoption of a new way of living and thinking about the world. Through the study and reading of literary texts, readers are led to reconsider their own way of living in their environment. Eco-critical analysis and writing make it possible to better understand the relationship of humans to nature, stimulate reflection, and encourage the questioning of actions and behaviors that have affected the environment for several centuries and more seriously since the beginning of industrialization. Moreover, current eco-critical writing, which is in full evolution, returns humans to their role as guardians of the earth, a role they should never have lost sight of as inhabitants of the planet who should, like other species do, while living from it, remain respectful of its environment. Many authors in the past, such as J.G. Ballard, The Drowned World 1962, Doris Lessing, The Making of the Representative for Planet 8 in 1982, or Margaret Atwood, McAdam in 2013, for example, had chosen to imagine, announce or denounce the collapse of the climate and its consequences. The authors I have mentioned in recent narrations have opted for a dynamic and peacefully enterprising vision, less in the observation and more in the suggestion of concrete and realistic reparative actions than their predecessors. It is also interesting to note the awareness that has gradually emerged since Masayo Miyoshi's article Turn to the Planet, Literature, Diversity and Totality in 2001. Extreme contemporary novels, through an approach that is both eco-critical, not utopian, but permacultural, demonstrate the validity of Miyoshi's hope to build a future that we will all share with an unprecedented commonality. However, to achieve this, we need to reimagine our common and universal culture as we have never done in human history. Such texts as those we have examined here show that this hope now may have become more realizable than ever. This cautious but real optimism is an important aspect of the direction and role that comparative literary studies can take in fueling an irreversible movement in the conception of the humanities in the age of the Anthropocene. The 5 slides that follow gather all the reference works I have used for this presentation, and I hope you will find them useful. And in the meantime, I thank you all for your attention.